Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you listening. I hope that all of you listening, wherever in the world you may be, that you are fit and well. Most of all, I hope that you realise just how incredibly blessed you are to have a God so great that he sent his only Son to die on a cross for your sins. Will you join me today as we continue on with our study of the book of Daniel? Today we will finish chapter number 11. And our reading is verses 40 to 45 of this chapter. So this is Daniel chapter 11, verses 40 to 45. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. This is the word of the Lord. Today we will finish chapter number 11. And you may feel quite relieved about that. Chapter 11, as I have pointed out before, contains a very complex and detailed prophecy. In order to highlight just how accurate the prophecy was, it was necessary to do a deep historical dive. And depending on your feelings about ancient history, you may have enjoyed the past few weeks or found it to be a bit tedious. I certainly hope it was the former. I've enjoyed doing the research, and I hope that I have managed to convey some of that to you in some way. Before we turn to the final verses of the chapter, let me briefly touch on the highlights of last week. We looked, as I hope you all remember, at verses 29 to 39. The section begins by talking about an evil, tyrannical ruler who would emerge in the 2nd century BC. This wicked man hated God and his chosen people, and did all within his power to destroy them. In this regard, he certainly fits with all the necessary requirements for being the very first Antichrist. Then, in verse 36, we arrive at an intersection. We are about to make a dramatic directional change. From this point on, the angelic being tells Daniel about the Antichrist of the far future. He is the evil ruler who will come to the fore in the 70th week, the time of tribulation. Well, let me take a few moments then to tell you more about these two men. Now, we have popular theatre shows in the UK around Christmas time called pantomimes. They are light-hearted, family-friendly performances put on for this particular festive season. Many people go to watch pantomimes in the build-up to Christmas. Although the stories of pantomimes vary, they almost always have a good character pitched against a dastardly villain. The audience are encouraged to cheer loudly when the hero comes on stage. They are equally encouraged to boo or hiss when the villain appears. So feel quite free, if you fancy, to boo and hiss whenever I mention the name of this vile enemy of God's people, the Antichrist. Let's all boo then, as we look at Antichrist number 1, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus IV was born around the year 215 BC. His father was Antiochus III, and he originally named his son Mithridates. This name means given by Mithra. Mithra, of course, being the ancient sun god. Antiochus IV effectively stole the throne from the rightful successor in the year 175 BC. Like all the rulers of the Seleucid Empire, Antiochus had a deep and abiding hatred for the Ptolemaic Empire that was based in Egypt. He desired to conquer their empire and absorb it into his own massive realm. In the year of 167 BC, he marched his vast army south in order to do just that. He would have been able to accomplish this feat, but for one thing. Unfortunately for him, the Ptolemies had made a pact with the Romans. This pact stated that the Romans would support them militarily when needed, and this is exactly what happened. Antiochus's forces were happily marching towards Alexandria when they were halted by the Roman army led by Gaius Popillius Laenus. The meeting between the two leaders has gone down in legend. The story goes that when they met, Gaius drew a line in the sand and dared Antiochus to cross it. Antiochus's choice was stark: fight and lose, or retreat and be humiliated. Antiochus, of course, was a prideful and arrogant man, but he was also no fool. He knew that his forces could not match the Romans. Therefore, he very wisely decided to withdraw. However, the shame and the humiliation of what had happened burned deep within him. He longed to take out his fury on some weak and unsuspecting foe. Unfortunately, the poor unsuspecting foe just happened to be the people of Jerusalem. On his way back north to his capital in Antioch, Antiochus decided to stop off in the holy city. When he arrived, he sent his general Apollonius into the city, backed up by a force of around 22,000 men. Once inside, the bloodthirsty slaughter began. The Seleucid forces butchered every man that they could find, and captured the women and children either for prisoners or to sell into slavery. This horrific event set into motion Antiochus's long-term plans to torment and persecute the Jewish people. What he wanted was to eradicate Judaism and force the people to adopt the ideals and practices of Hellenism. In order to achieve this, he made life unbearable for God's people. He banned them from openly practicing their faith, outlawed their holy days and festivals, and desecrated the temple by placing a statue of Zeus on the altar. The pinnacle of his wickedness occurred on the 16th of December in the year 167 BC. On this particular day, Antiochus went into the temple and sacrificed a pig on the holy altar. This made the temple ceremonially unclean, and effectively meant that the twice-daily sacrifices to God had to be suspended. As you can imagine, the Jewish people were deeply traumatized by these events. They elicited a number of different responses. Some, fearful about what resisting might mean, went along with what Antiochus was doing. Others, I'm happy to say, were far more resolute. They would not let their culture be destroyed without a fight. Most famous among the resistors was a man named Judas Maccabeus, Judas the Hammerer. He formed a resistance movement along with his brothers to fight the tyranny that gripped his nation. At first, this small group engaged in guerrilla warfare tactics, and in this they were very successful. Later, as more people joined their movement, they formed a proper army. Another group of more academically minded people, known as the Hasidim, also emerged at this time. They clung doggedly to the faith and instructed many through these difficult years. We should not overlook the importance this group had in preserving the faith and character of the Jewish people. It certainly would not be an easy time for God's people. Many brave men would fall in the war against the Seleucids, but eventually God would permit them to succeed. They would drive the Seleucid forces out of their land and enjoy a brief time of independence. Then this brought us, quite neatly, to verse number 36. Are you ready to boo again? Well, let's shift now and turn our attention to the second Antichrist. We are, of course, here talking about future events that are shrouded in considerable mystery. We might all wish that the Bible revealed much more about what will happen in the future, but I'm afraid we must be content with what we are given. This means, therefore, that a certain degree of speculation is called for. And this is why Bible scholars and teachers differ so widely on their interpretations of these end-time prophecies. One of the most interesting debates concerns who the Antichrist will be, what he will be like, and where he will come from. As an aside, my belief in a pre-tribulation rapture means that as believers we will be in heaven with Christ before the Antichrist rises to power. Or to put it more simply, we simply won't get to see him. Here in verses 36 to 39, the angel gives Daniel a few more details about this man. We learn that he will be an incredibly prideful and arrogant man who does exactly as he wills. He will be characterized by being selfish and self-centered. This becomes manifest in the detail that he will exalt himself and have no regard either for the one true God or for the other man-made religions of this world. We know this because he blasphemes God. He says profane and disrespectful things about God, which are intended to undermine God and to essentially promote himself. He demands that people worship him as if he were a god. We also learn that he will prosper for a time, or, to put it more accurately, God will permit him to succeed for an appointed time. This, you see, is because this is all a part of God's divine plan. The angel also reveals to Daniel some interesting tidbits about the Antichrist's background and habits. He tells us that the Antichrist will ignore or snub the religion of his ancestors. Some have read this and thought that it means that the Antichrist will be a Jew. When we spoke last time, we talked about why this probably won't be the case. What it really means is that he has no regard or no respect for any particular divine being. As we noted last time, the only one he deems worthy of worship is himself. He will also have no desire, we read, for women. Now, this may mean that he is a homosexual, or that he is an abuser of women, or simply that he is someone with no natural affection. Others suggest that it means that he has no desire for the Messiah. Bearing the Messiah, of course, was the dream of every Jewish woman. The final thing we touched on last time was the Antichrist's fixation on military might. He will invest heavily in building up his army. His belief will be that his power and might rest in the military strength that he possesses. The more tanks, missiles, rocket launchers, attack helicopters, and jets that he possesses, the happier he will be. This military might will come to the fore in the epic battles for supremacy that will take place in this end-time period. As we noted before, the Antichrist initially is seen as being a great peacemaker. He is regarded as the man who can bring peace to the Middle East, a feat that most around the world today consider to be utterly impossible. He will be universally respected and admired, especially by the people of Israel. This will bring peace, which will prevail for the first half of the tribulation period, 3.5 years. But once we reach this midpoint, it's not long before his peace-loving facade slips and things begin to fall apart. And it's from this point onwards that we will see determined opposition to the Antichrist emerge. Large confederacies from both the north and the south will converge upon Israel. And this will be the subject of our sermon today. Verse 40. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. We are now at around the halfway point of the 70th week, the 7-year time of tribulation. That is what's meant here by the expression, at the time of the end. As we have established, by this time the Antichrist, the he and the him in this verse, along with his military forces, have established themselves in Israel. He has chosen this particular place to make his headquarters. We are then told that two powerful armies will come against him simultaneously. The first army mentioned here comes from a southerly direction. So we're thinking here of nations geographically located to the south of Israel. Now, in earlier studies, we spoke about Egypt as being the enemy to the south, and it is entirely possible that a contingent from Egypt is involved in this attack. However, it's much more likely that a number of nations have formed a coalition and are approaching Israel as a united force. They are fully aware of the power of the Antichrist and will feel that they have a much greater chance of success if they work together. We saw a similar thing in the Six-Day War against Israel in the year of 1967. On that occasion, Egypt, Syria and Jordan worked in unison. So who then might be included in such a coalition for this end-time battle? Well, it's difficult for us to be precise, but I think we can fairly safely say that they will be Islamic nations who currently occupy countries in northern and central Africa. When it comes to the armies moving down from the north, the Bible does furnish us with much more information. To uncover this information, we have to turn to the prophet Ezekiel. In chapters 38 and 39 of the book of Ezekiel, we read about Magog and her allies attacking Israel. Now, there is some scholarly disagreement about when these things will take place, but my view is that Ezekiel is telling us about an end-time event in which a peaceful Israel is surprisingly attacked. In many ways, it mirrors exactly what we read here in the book of Daniel. Chapter 38 of Ezekiel mentions 6 nations by name. Well, let's look at the appropriate verses and see if we can go some way in identifying exactly who these nations might be. So this is verse 2 of Ezekiel chapter 38. Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach and Tubal, and prophesy against him. The first nation or land mentioned is Magog. Now, historically speaking, Magog was the son of Japheth. You can read about that in Genesis chapter 10. After the Tower of Babel, this particular people group scattered quite widely. Christian historian Dr. Bill Cooper provides evidence that the descendants of Magog also includes a wide array of differing people groups. His extensive research shows that they included in this group could be the Russians, Ukrainians, Hungarians, Finns, Siberians, Yugoslavians, Croatians, Bosnians, Serbians, Slovenians, Slovakians, Bulgarians, Poles and Czechs. We also read the names of people groups who inhabited this area: the Prince of Rosh, Meshach and Tubal. These are ancient names of people who lived in northern Mesopotamia and the region of the Caucasus Mountains. Today these areas lie in modern-day Russia. Well, let's look at the next 5. These are from Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 5. Persia, Ethiopia and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet, Gomer and all its troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north and all its troops. Many people are with you. Well, first we read about Persia. This, as I'm sure you are all aware, is the ancient name for Iran. The nation of Iran has seldom been out of the headlines over the past few years. The great fear of Israel and the West in general is that this nation develops a nuclear weapon of some kind. Such an event will clearly destabilize the entire region. We then read about Ethiopia, which probably incorporates Sudan and Libya. Now, you may look at these two nations today and wonder why they might be drawn into this attack. You might also ask how well trained and equipped their respective militaries may be. Well, you may be unaware of Russian influence and involvement in both nations. The Foreign Policy website reported in early 2025 that Russia had come to an agreement with the Sudanese government to establish a naval base near Port Sudan. The Russians also negotiated a deal to use an airbase in southern Libya. Both of these moves were militarily driven. Vladimir Putin was reported as being keen to station military assets in these key strategic areas. So now you begin to see how all these things may indeed tie together. A Sudanese or Libyan military supplied by Russia is a different proposition altogether. Well, next we come to Goma. Where is Goma, you may ask? Well, it refers to the area now occupied, in the main, by modern-day Turkey. For many years it seemed as though Turkey looked towards the west. They were indeed a Muslim nation, but they were not particularly hard-line or extreme. As a nation they had aspirations to be part of the European Union. But in recent years this policy seems to have been reversed. Now Turkey aligns itself with those who hate Israel and wish to see her destroyed. Once again we see how biblical prophecy taking shape before our very eyes. Finally we read about the house of Togarmah. In Ezekiel's days, Togarmah was another tribal group of people who were located in the eastern part of what you and I know today as the nation of Turkey. So what the angelic messenger then is delivering to Daniel is as follows. At some point around the midpoint of the tribulation period, two armies will come to attack the Antichrist, who is basing himself in Israel. The northern division will come like a whirlwind. This most likely speaks to the speed and precision of their attacks. They will come with a large and very well-equipped army. The angel is speaking to Daniel, of course, in the 5th century BC, so obviously he uses military terms or descriptions that were appropriate and understandable to Daniel. The armies that clash at some future time in Israel will not be riding in horse-drawn chariots. They will be employing contemporary weapons, military drones, tanks, ballistic missiles and jet fighters. We then read that he, meaning the Antichrist, will have victory over these two armies. They will be overwhelmed by his forces. We are probably to assume here that the enemy forces, those who came against the Antichrist, who survived these battles, will retreat to their respective homelands. Following this military success, the Antichrist and his army will pass through and conquer a number of nations. We saw the German forces doing a similar thing during the Second World War. They entered Poland and occupied it before moving on to the Netherlands and France. Well, let's turn now and discover what the Antichrist does following this victory. Verse 41. He shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. We learn here that the Antichrist will enter Israel, the glorious land. As we know, the Antichrist had made a covenant or an agreement with Israel. This deal began the final 7-year countdown clock. So it would appear that this aggressive move against the chosen people signals the breaking of this peace treaty. This places us, as I have said before, at the midway point of the tribulation. At this time, many countries will be conquered by the forces that are under the control of the Antichrist. It seems probable, highly likely, that the Antichrist was greatly angered by the rebellious armies that came against him from the north and south. He's now engaged then in an action designed to effectively nullify their power and render them unable to come against him again. 3 nations or people groups escape from his hands. The 3 are Edom, Moab and Ammon. You can see these historic locations of these nations on the map on the screen. They are all, you will note, located east of Israel, today in modern-day Jordan. Interestingly, all 3 people groups mentioned here were all historic and bitter enemies of Israel. Now, quite clearly, these people groups no longer exist. You cannot visit Moab today and converse with a Moabite, so it's likely that it is the geography that is in view here and not the ethnicity of these people. The proximity of these regions to Israel means that this is the most natural place for God's people to flee to as the Antichrist forces approach. So it may well be that these regions are receiving divine protection, and that is why the Antichrist cannot capture them. Well, let's read on. Verse 42. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. Despite not being able to conquer Edom, Moab, and Ammon, things are going well for the Antichrist and his army. He will press home his advantage by attacking a number of different countries. This is what is meant here by the expression, to stretch his hand against. The idea being conveyed is that if you are able to reach out and touch something, then you have agency and the ability to act upon something. The converse, of course, is also true. If you are unable to stretch out and touch something, then you do not have the power to act. Clearly then at this time, the Antichrist is in the ascendancy and has the power to act and destroy those who came against him. Egypt in particular is singled out here. As I mentioned to you before, they may well have been one of the nations that came against the Antichrist. So it's likely that he is now exacting his revenge upon them. But let's continue on and see what he does to the nation of Egypt. Verse 43. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. The Egyptians will be no match for the Antichrist. He will conquer them and plunder their treasures, their gold and silver. The fact that he has access to their most precious and treasured possessions indicates their total capitulation. Had they been able to withstand or resist the conquest in any way, they might have kept back or hidden their most valuable items. We then also learn that the Antichrist continued his advances and conquered both the Libyans and the Ethiopians. It appears as if no one at this time can stand against this satanically empowered man. It's quite possible that it is this sense of invincibility that leads him to exalt himself. He seeks to crush the institutions that still exist and really impose his will upon the world. This then may be the point during the tribulation in which he abolishes the religions of the world and sets himself up as the object of worship. He will tolerate no other kings or gods. He demands that he alone hold the place and position usually reserved for a deity. So picture then in your minds the scene. The Antichrist upon his ornate and fancy throne. This evil man seemingly in complete control. From a worldly perspective, he does indeed seem to have it all. Riches beyond compare, power, authority, and an almost godlike status. But it's at this point that things start to go wrong. According to many conservative prophecy scholars, it is at this point that God begins to pour out his wrath against the earth. Well, let's read on. Verse 44. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. We might picture the Antichrist enjoying himself in his royal residence, surrounded by excessive luxury, indulging in the finest foods and wines, being entertained by the greatest musicians and performers, when all of a sudden a messenger arrives to give him some troubling news. What we might ask is the nature of this news. All we are told is that something was happening to the east and the north. The most likely explanation is that enemy forces are approaching from these two directions. It may be that the enemy forces that he had already beaten have regrouped or have been reinforced at this point. He might have believed them to be totally crushed, but this is not the case. Another commonly held view is that these are different armies moving in to now challenge his rule. Some suggest that this army from the east is China, or a coalition force from the Far East. The Antichrist will not sit back and allow his authority to be challenged. He again musters his forces and goes out to fight. Many will be killed in this conflict. But let's turn now and look at our final verse for today. Verse 45. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. The Antichrist is once again successful. This perhaps should not surprise us. He has Satan and all his minions on his side. Following the victory, he returns to Israel to establish his headquarters, his palace. The detail that we are given about the location of his headquarters is that it is between the seas. The two seas that would have been known to Daniel are the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea. So he will site his palace at some point between these two bodies of water. We also learn that it is situated on the glorious holy mountain. What mountain is this? This, I believe, is Mount Zion. Mount Zion is the high hill on which King David built a citadel. It's on the southeastern side of the city of Jerusalem, the city of God. As we read in Psalm 87, his foundation is in the holy mountains. The Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. Glorious things are spoken of you, O city of God. Psalm 87 verses 1 to 3. These verses reveal to us how God feels about this holy mountain and what stands there. It is a place that God loves. This is why the Antichrist, motivated by Satan of course, chooses Jerusalem. We know that there is nothing more insulting or disrespectful to someone than to go to their treasured place of residence and defile it. By this point in history, the nation of Israel will have been devastated. 2/3 of the Jewish people will have been killed. That's a tough thought to wrap your head around. Israel's current population stands at approximately 9.5 million. So that means by this point in time, only 3 million or so Jews will still be alive in Israel. The Antichrist then has been victorious. His armies have crushed all resistance. They came from the north and south. They combined their forces against him and still could not defeat him. This is how it all ends. It ends with the world consumed by this tyrannical, bloodthirsty, demon-possessed man. Or does it? One little word causes us to pause. It is the word yet. We read the wonderful news, yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. Allow me to flesh out how the Antichrist, the beast, comes to an end. In Revelation chapter 19, we read about the Lord Jesus Christ's second coming. He comes down from heaven in glory, riding on a white horse, followed by the armies of heaven. From his mouth comes a sword, which he uses to strike the nations. The Antichrist may have been more than a match for the armies of this earth, but he's no match for our Lord and Saviour. The battle that ensues is over quickly. It's not really a battle at all. It's a wholly one-sided affair, more an act of God's judgment than a proper fight. The Antichrist will be soundly beaten. How insanely stupid he must be to think that he can oppose the sovereign God of the universe. He will then face an appropriate punishment. His punishment, so we read in Revelation 19:20, will be to be cast alive into the lake of burning fire. The remainder of the Antichrist's army are slain by the sword. This is how it all comes to an end. Well, next time, Lord willing, we will begin the final leg of our journey as we start chapter number 12. Lessons to learn. We're going to do something a little different today. As we've come to the end of chapter 11, let's look back on the whole chapter and consider what we can learn from it. I have drawn 10 lessons from chapter 11. Number 1, the sovereignty of God. Throughout the chapter, we see a vivid example of God's sovereignty over the affairs of nations and kings. Despite the rise and fall of empires, God always remains in complete control. This reminds us that no matter how chaotic the world seems, God is the ultimate ruler, orchestrating history according to his divine plan. So keep this in mind as we continue to see things becoming increasingly troubling around the world. Number 2, the power of prophecy. Daniel chapter 11 is a testament to the power of prophecy. This is because, as we have seen, it accurately predicts historical events with remarkable precision. This chapter reminds us that God's word is trustworthy and true. As believers, we can find comfort in knowing that the Bible is not just a historical document, but a living testament to God's omniscience and his plan for humanity. Number 3, the rise and fall of kingdoms. The chapter outlines the rise and fall of various kingdoms, illustrating for us the transient nature of earthly power. As we know from our study of any history, empires, kings and rulers come and go. We would therefore do well to remember that worldly power is temporary, and our ultimate allegiance should be to God's eternal kingdom. Number 4, the importance of faithfulness. Amidst the political turmoil described in Daniel 11, the call to remain faithful to God is starkly clear. The chapter encourages us to stand firm in our faith, even when faced with adversity. As believers, we are called to be steadfast, trusting in God's promises and his ultimate victory. Number 5, the reality of spiritual warfare. Daniel chapter 11 highlights the spiritual battles that are ongoing behind the scenes of earthly events. This chapter reminds us that our struggles are not merely against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces. Number 6, the consequences of pride. The chapter warns against the dangers of pride, as seen in the actions of the kings who exalt themselves above God. Daniel 11 serves as a cautionary tale, urging us to remain humble and reliant on God's wisdom rather than our own understanding. Number 7, the assurance of God's justice. Despite the apparent success of wicked rulers, Daniel 11 assures us that God's justice will ultimately prevail. The chapter reveals that those who oppose God will one day face judgment. This reinforces the truth that righteousness will be rewarded and evil will one day be punished. Number 8, the role of God's people. In the midst of the chaos described in Daniel chapter 11, God's people are called to be a light in the darkness. The chapter encourages us to be bold in our witness, sharing the hope of the gospel with those around us. Number 9, the hope of deliverance. Daniel 11 points to the hope of deliverance for God's people, even in the face of persecution. This chapter reminds us that God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. As we trust in him, we can be confident that he will deliver us from every trial and tribulation. Number 10, the ultimate victory of God's kingdom. Finally, Daniel 11 foreshadows the ultimate victory of God's kingdom over all earthly powers. This chapter assures us that in the end, God's kingdom will reign supreme and every knee will bow to Jesus Christ. As believers, we can look forward to the day when God's perfect justice and peace will be fully realized on earth.
Also, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood up to confirm and strengthen him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up, and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these. Also the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. And at the end of some years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand. But she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. But from a branch of her roots one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army, enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them, and prevail. And he shall also carry their gods captive to Egypt, with their princes and their precious articles of silver and gold. And he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Also the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. However, his sons shall stir up strife, and assemble a multitude of great forces. And one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through. Then he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife. And the king of the south shall be moved with rage, and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy. When he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cast down tens of thousands, but he will not prevail. For the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment. Now, in those times, many shall rise up against the king of the south. Also, violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fall. So the king of the north shall come and build a siege mound, and take a fortified city. And the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist. But he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do. And he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy it. But she shall not stand with him, or be for him. After this he shall turn his face to the coastlands, and shall take many. But a ruler shall bring the reproach against them to an end. And with the reproach removed, he shall turn back on him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall, and not be found. There shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom. But within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle. And in his place shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty. But he shall come in peaceably, and seize the kingdom by intrigue. With the force of a flood they shall be swept away from before him and be broken. And also the prince of the covenant. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably, even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table. But it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant. So he shall do damage and return to his own land. At the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south. But it shall not be like the former or the latter. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved, and return in rage against the holy covenant, and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices, and place there the abomination of desolation. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. But the people who know their God shall be strong, and carry out great exploits. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now, when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help. But many shall join with them by intrigue, and some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, purify them, and make them white, until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. Then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all. But in their place he shall honor a god of fortresses, and a god which his fathers did not know he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and divide the land for gain. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him.